We are very happy to have you, and thank you very much for accepting to be here, to finding this meeting also interesting for you. We hope that we will make it really interesting. The idea here was to not only to present a handbook, which has been published just a few months ago, but also to raise a discussion involving some of the contributors to the book, of a handbook, but also asking Michael Fine, who is between among us now, to open a discussion, which we would like to share with you, also inviting you to raise your hands and to raise your comments or questions, whatever you want to say. Okay. Now the program of the webinars is the following. We will have a short presentation by myself and Tine. We will present only the few things about the handbook. Then we will invite the 4 contributors of particular chapters to shortly describe what they have done in their own chapters. We have Mary Daly, we have Sue Handel, we have Rossella Ciccia and Chiara Saraceno, and they will have really, sorry for this, really short time to do it, but hopefully that will be really attractive for all of us. And then Michael Fine has accepted to serve as our first discussant, our only discussant actually at the moment. And then after that, we will open the floor for discussion with the public. Okay, this is the plan. So we hope to have a lot of time for common discussion with you. Okay, now I'm going to share a few slides by which we will present the main, I would say, the main aspects of this handbook.
And while you do that, I would just inform people that this session is being recorded. You probably had to accept that when you entered the seminar room, and we will later hope to share this on Elgar's webpage. Also, we will, for the discussion, we will ask you to raise your hand. You're also welcome to write comments in the chat section, but we will try to conduct the discussion via raising your hand. So let's see how it goes.
Okay. Give me only a sign that now the slides is visible to all of you. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. Okay. This is the Research Handbook on Social Care Policy that Tina and I, we edited, and the handbook was published just a few months ago by Edward Elgar. And we also need to remember that this handbook was in some way also a product of a transforming care network involving hundreds of people around the world, and most of the people contributing to this handbook comes from this network. And in some way, the basis of our analysis, of our elaboration, is also the activities, the conferences, the seminars that we organize as network. Okay. The ambition of a handbook. Basically, the initial ambition was to contribute to, in some way, to foster the study of social care, and considering more and more this field as a recognized and institutionalized public policy field. This is our starting point. We got the idea that social care policy are not anymore the Cinderella of welfare state research. For many years, this was considered a kind of marginal field of work and also of analysis. This is not anymore the case. There is, in the last years, growing availability of data, which makes possible also today to develop a lot of comparative analysis, to have a more evidence-based analysis in this field. We have now a stronger understanding of institutional variations across countries, across regimes, of the different features of care systems, also considering the international scale. And also there is a greater awareness that social care policies are become very important also for many different normative issues, ethical issues, which are very important in Italy. Just to mention the end-of-life discussion, the discussion about maternity, and other things like this. So the idea is that this is not anymore a marginal field. But at the same time, this is an assumption that we are trying to be coherent with along all the handbook contribution, is that we would like to consider childcare, long-term care, and disability as three policy fields which have something in common. At the center of this idea, there's the concept of social care, of course. And we can provide, and we provide in handbook many different definitions. What you find now in the slides is one of a possible definition that can be used, considering activities, but not only activities, but also relationships, involves in attendance to social, physical, and emotional requirements of dependent adults and children. We know that all these three policy fields are not defined as such as only as a care policy field. They combine together the care perspective with also other perspectives. In the disability studies, care is also in some way criticized as an important approach, because it seems that a care perspective can in some way hidden the most important dimension of autonomy. In our approach, in our idea, care does not exclude a notion, even stronger notion of autonomy, and also the presence of other relevant aspects in these policy fields, such as education, such as healthcare. But still, we think there is something which can be interesting to considering jointly these three different policy fields in one. And what is particular in this social care policy field, as we try to define it? And we can identify many different aspects. Among them, now I can highlight just these ones, which in our opinion are very, very important. They mix political economy and social care, mixing together governmental provision, civil society provision, market-led provision of social service. Okay, quindi this mixed architecture of a care system, which is also different across countries. The great influence of values and normative orientations in the policy discussion and decision, making decisions and also policy aims may be more complex in this field than in other fields. At the same time, the weak recognition of social rights, care has been longly defined as a weak social right, but also weak recognition of a need assessment, based sometimes on discretionary shifting policy priorities. And also the variation in the level of institutionalization, because we cannot consider in this field that institutionalization of care is something that can be considered as granted, because it's over time challenged by policy changes across different countries. And of course, a weaker or lower level of institutionalization, as it happens in some countries, challenge makes the policy implementation more difficult than in other fields. In the last year, we have seen a clear trend toward a growing politicization of social care policy. Social care policy has entered the public debate, the electoral agendas, much more than before. Care-related issues are frequently debated, discussed in the public discussion, in the public opinion, and have become also key components also of political party programs. This is something that, in some way, mirrors the importance of and the politicization, the fact that we are discussing not only about the technical issues, but also about aims and directions of public policy. There's been an important development in the regulatory frameworks, more stronger regulation governing the access and eligibility to care services and benefits, more attention paid to the professional requirement for care workers, to the social security rights of caregivers, more attention driven to the quality of care and other issues like this. So in general terms, regulation in this field has increased, has become more important than it was before, reducing the arbitrary procedures that were dominant even in previously. And last point, there's been a clear trend toward increase in the public spending. This also against also the austerity measures and against what happens during the crisis time. And this is clearly seen in very simple figures showing that, for example, in long-term care, the public spending trends expressed in share of GDP has mainly increased in the last 30 years in all around the different care regimes. The same trends, even though less pronounced, you find also in the childcare policies, where again, with some different trends in some countries, but basically the trend at the world scale has been clearly an increase. So we have this evidence. Tine, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you. So one of the findings that we have is that the traditional care regime theory is still useful, and we also apply it in the book, but it also needs updating. We can say that the care regime literature has been very important for understanding differences between countries, and in particular in terms of whether the systems are based on a state approach, the involvement of the family or the market, and what kind of social rights, obligations, and so on are associated with this. But we think that the handbook very clearly shows us these categories no longer fully capture the current developments. First, there's now greater variation within regimes, not just between them. So we see countries which seem maybe before were quite clearly having the same institutional design and so on, are now taking different tracks and going along different paths. The Nordic region might be the strongest. I know Mary has once said this, that this is where we find the most unique regime model. But in other ways, I think we think in the book that the most regimes actually show more variation and they're diversified. Second, universal social rights to care have expanded beyond Europe, and this shows the global relevance of care policy. We can say the increasing understanding in the political sphere about developing care policies, and also ensuring that people, regardless of their incomes and social position and so on, have access to care. Third, we see that disability policies have often been neglected compared to childcare and long-term care. And this includes also the understanding of the categories that go into policies, the spending levels, and so on. So it's a harder time to analyze disability policies and users of disability policies. We also see increasing diversification of EC&C and long-term care policies, so childcare and long-term care policies, with increasingly different aims, organization, skill levels of the professionals, and also outcome measures. And this increases the complexity of talking about care regimes. And again, this is even harder when we then want to bring in disability policies. We also see that in the literature, there is predominantly a focus on services and therefore a gap in the exploration of cash benefits and care leaves. And this is, of course, something that therefore overlooks the importance of informal carers and their contribution to solving care needs. And finally, more attention is needed on the care workers, we find, in terms of their working conditions, but also in terms of what quality of care is being provided and how is the organization of services actually taking place. These are elements which are often overlooked in comparison to, for instance, institutional design and outcomes. So overall, we say that care regimes remain useful, but we need more dynamic and differentiated approaches. Next slide, please. Are you showing the next?
Sorry, there was something wrong.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
We also see that the expansion of care policies have created important trade-offs. And one of these tensions is between expanding the access and maintaining quality, and also in combination with labor shortages that we find both in long-term care and early childhood education and care. And in general, we find that quality of care is a quite fluffy concept and also varies across the sector. So here, more work in terms of the concepts are certainly needed. Another issue is the increasing marketization and privatization of care, which may increase inequalities in what access users have. So who have access and which norms and obligations are guiding this access. This also goes in terms of informalization, that we see the families for sure still a very important source of care, but what are the sort of what gives right to this kind of care is often not considered, and also in terms of if we are seeing this privatization of care, what is then the balance between formal and informal care? There are also new ideas about autonomy and active aging within long-term care, and this creates tensions between independence and the need for support. While in childcare, we see increasing focus on educare, the learning aspects of providing childcare, and moving in that direction away from providing care as such without these learning elements. So these developments show that care policy is not just expanding, but also becoming more politically, professionally, and ethically complex. And this reflects broader changes, which we discuss in the introductory chapter, as we see care is increasingly seen as a social right, but also shaped by economic and demographic pressures. Next slide, please. So in regards to new issues and perspectives, we identify a growing attention to what we see were previously neglected aspects of care. First, there is more focus on care recipients, who are now seen as active participants and sometimes co-producers of care, rather than passive beneficiaries. And we see this human rights perspective also increasingly coming in. This was the theme of the 2025 Transforming Care Conference, and I think we learned a lot from a meeting up there. Second, research increasingly looks at inequalities in care, including inequalities across gender, class, migration, background, and also using the intersectionality approach. One of these outcomes have been in terms of care poverty, which is a new way of seeing whether needs are met. And third, there is a growing focus on the professionalization of care work and the concerns over shortages of labor and the need to improve working conditions and recognitions of care workers. These issues are increasingly taken up. So overall, we think these trends show that care policies is not only expanding, but also becoming more complex and socially important. And this is why care has become a recognized policy and also academic field. Thank you. Next slide. So the organization of the handbook is structured into 7 parts, covering what we have identified as the main dimensions of social care policy. Part 1 introduces the conceptual foundation and explains how social care emerged as a policy field. Part 2 focuses on the 3 core domains: childcare, long-term care, and disability policy. And Part 3 examines how care is organized, especially the financing and service provision. Part 4 looks at care work and the growing importance of workforce issues. And Part 5 discusses key policy issues such as care quality, social investment, power dynamics, and user involvement. Part 6 provides a comparative country perspective across care systems. And finally, Part 7 focuses on outcomes, including the impact of COVID-19. So together, these parts provide a comprehensive overview of social care policy from theory to outcome. And we are very happy that today we have different authors from different sections of the book presenting their work. But here you see the full chapter structure. Next slide, please. So if you want to know more about the book, you can find on Elgar information on also how to purchase it. And there is an ebook available also, which is a bit less pricey. Next slide. So now we are starting the discussion section, and we're very happy that we have these 4 contributors from the book. We have Mary Daly from Oxford University, who will present the concept of care from origin to future challenges. Sue Yandel from Sheffield University will talk about work-care reconciliation, tensions and emerging issues. Rosella Ciccia from Oxford University will talk about the concept of care, from origins to future challenges. No, I think there is, Costanzo, I think this is the wrong title.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And Chiara
then we'll clarify.
Okay, we'll get the right title. And Chiara Saraceno from the University of Turin will talk about social investments in care policies. And we are very happy to have with us our colleague all the way from Australia. Thank you for staying up so late, Michael Fine, who's the honorary professor at the Department of Sociology at Macquarie University in Sydney. And after the presentations, we will have public discussion with the attendants. So I'll turn over to you, Costanzo, to chair this session.
Yeah. Okay. So now it's time to go to the contributors. And so, Mary, I give you the floor for your presentation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Costanzo, and thank you, Tina. And hello, everybody. It's very nice that you're here to join us today, and I'm very happy to talk about my chapter, the title of which Tina has already indicated. It's called The Concept of Care from Origins to Future Challenges. And this is a strong theme in my work, really, trying to plumb the depths of care as a concept, but also the limits of care as a concept. And that's really what I try to do in this chapter. And I do it for three reasons, really. One is, I think, despite great development of the concept, some of which has been referred to already, I think we still are not precise enough in our use of it, in our work. I think the second reason is because care is a very complex concept. It has different roots, even linguistically it has different roots, but also it has very different roots in our social systems, our economic systems, and our value systems, for example. And the third reason is that I think there is potential in the concept. And I think it has, the possibility of its applications, but also thinking through it, are very broad and exciting. So taking a perspective in the chapter that includes both childcare and long-term care, I do two things in the chapter. One is I look at the literatures and try to put some organization on the different literatures, which are very diverse. And the second is I try and identify the learnings and insights that come from the literatures that we can take forward. In the first part of the chapter, and I have only a few minutes, so I have to be very brief, I think there are four main ways in which care has been developed, or four main literatures in which care has been developed. The first is probably the oldest one, which is, I would call, a feminist literature, understanding care as labor and care as embedded in obligations and in gendered and increasingly other systems of inequality. And that literature particularly asks the question about what is care and how is care related to broader systems, whether in the economy, the family, the society, and so forth. The second literature, also in many ways a critical literature, and again feminism with a very strong root, is care in the hands of the welfare state. Leading to very strong scholarship around the details of policy, for example, whether for children or older people. And thirdly, we have a more organizational literature that comes maybe more from health sciences and economics as a profession that is very interested in meeting need, the efficiency of meeting need of our systems and so forth. And then a final, also very strongly critical literature is the global ecology and the global politics literature, which highlights care as mobile and malleable and leading to very particular extensive forms of exploitations. I say in the chapter that these literatures are only partly in conversation with each other, which I think is really a pity in some respects, because I think they have three main strengths when taken together and in some cases individually. The first is that they can place, or they do place, care at the center. And here I think the kind of the promise of care shines through, because it's clear that it's able to really talk to the big boys of capitalism and other kind of historical and structural systems of economic relations and political relations. I don't think it's any longer a Cinderella concept, to borrow Costanzo's framing at the beginning. Secondly, I think, and relatedly, it can pinpoint underlying systems, whether they're systems of value, systems of welfare state provision, economic systems, social systems, family systems. And thirdly, another advantage, I think, of the concept and the literature, the way it's developed, is it's not just interdisciplinary in foundation, which I think is a strength, but I don't see that there's necessarily a hierarchy, an interdisciplinary hierarchy in the field. In the second part of the paper, I offer a number of elaborations on what I think are necessary. And the first is, again, going back to what we mean by the concept, how we use it, do we use it sufficiently, or do we use it well enough? And I think we can do better on this. I mean, I'm conscious that in my chapter, I do take childcare and early and long-term care together. And I think that's tricky, and I think we need to really be perhaps more critical of that. There are advantages and disadvantages. I call for what I call a differentiated articulation of the two. To be very simple, what I mean is that we need to be explicit about our use and why we have them within the same framework or why we don't. I also, and I'm nearly finished, in the second part of the paper, look at some existing concepts that I think we could use better. And some of these are coming out of the care literature, but they're also advanced by other literatures. And the first is about the relationship between care and inequality, and care as a source of inequality, but also care as putting or shedding a critical light on other sources of inequality, other systems of inequality, whether we understand these as intersectional or not. The second concept or set of literature that I think we could use better or might use better is that on the caring economy, which was a literature that really we heard a lot of, I think, through COVID-19, that period, and which has, in any case, been developing by both feminist scholars and economic scholars for at least, I suppose, 10 or 20 years. And that concept, too, I think, has promise, because it seeks to, it's a differentiated literature, but it seeks to actually enumerate care and to show how deeply embedded it is in the economy, particularly. But it also actually links production and reproduction, which is a real concern, I think, of many of us working in this field. And the final thing is that I think we need to work better on. I feel that I personally, and maybe others might feel this as well, that I'm personally not doing enough work on understanding the politics associated with care, whether childcare or care, long-term care. And these are, of course, particularly important in a time when right-wing interests are raising up these issues as actually the fundament, as a fundament to change society and to change our welfare states. So that was really, I think, the main things that I wanted to say about my chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, also for your idea about what we should try to do to develop in the future as a research community. I give the word now to the floor to Sue Yandel. Thank you, Sue, for being here. I remember that your chapter is chapter 5, Work, Care, Reconciliation, Tensions and Emerging Issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Costanzo. And can I begin by thanking you and Tine and congratulating you both on what I feel is going to be a really important research handbook for the future. Sure, it will be a valuable both reference source and a source of inspiration for scholars in the future. In my chapter, which is chapter 5 in the book, I begin, I think, by recognising that most care continues to be provided in almost all global societies today, as it has been for many centuries, by informal carers, what the people we now call informal carers or unpaid carers, by families and by people on an unpaid basis. And that's why I emphasise that work-care reconciliation is crucial for social care policy. I also think it's important to recognise that it's a relatively new policy area. Costanzo and Tine in their chapter talk about the fact that social care policy itself is in its sort of first century as a focus of analysis. Work care reconciliation policy making is in its first 40 or 50 years. So it's a relatively new concept, and the research on it is still in need of further development. This relative novelty, I think, makes it particularly important that we explore its origins, its potentialities, and the crucial role that work care reconciliation policies can play in the operation and development of social care policies more generally. The need for work care reconciliation policy emerged in post-World War II debates in European and US and other societies on the role of women. And in that phase, which was rooted in the feminist debates, which became very active in the 1960s and 1970s, the focus was on childcare, that aspect of work care reconciliation, before we were really using that term, and the issues of equality at work for women. After the carers movement sprang up, and this has been a focus of much of my own work and an ongoing focus of my publications, and in particular, after the carers movement began to mobilise at the international level, which arises in the 1980s and 1990s, the importance of work care reconciliation for unpaid carers of older and disabled people began to emerge. And this now, I think, is a central plank of care policies. The first really influential work that recognised international perspectives on work care reconciliation was only published in 1999. I refer there to Viola Lechner and Margaret Neal's book, Work and Caring for the Elderly, which was published in 1999. And of course, in 2005, the ILO produced a book written by Catherine Hine, which looked at reconciling work and family responsibilities. My chapter in the handbook explores developments in combining family and working lives developed since 1945. And the key things that have happened, if you like, at an international organisation level was that in 1965, the International Labour Organization recognised that there needed to be a recommendation on what it then thought of as women with family responsibilities in workforces around the world. By 1981, it had changed that focus, and in the convention that it introduced in 1981, Convention number 156, which is called Workers with Family Responsibilities, it began to open up the idea that care is a responsibility of all. It is not the responsibility of women workers. It is an activity undertaken by both women and men workers. In the chapter, I talk about demographic and related changes, things like increased longevity, the introduction of the ability to control fertility. I talk about structural changes in employment and labour markets, and in particular, the unravelling of standardised employment arrangements, which mean that in our contemporary period, when we're seeing much more precarity in workforces and much more variation in working hours, we've got particular challenges arising in work care reconciliation. I talk about the gradual evolution of care services and the development of policies relevant to unpaid carers. Policy on support for working carers specifically took some inspiration from developments in childcare, and we can find examples of places where policy lobbying has piggybacked on childcare policy developments, so that we can see developments that have been focused in childcare arrangements focused on mothers and later parents. And then when we move on to informal and unpaid carers, we see a focus which nevertheless is very significantly differentiated from the childcare arrangements, because it relies upon two struggles which still remain relevant today. The struggle for recognition of carer status by others, and the struggle for self-identification as a person, as a person with a caring role. The developments that I address in the chapter look at pension and social security protections, look at legislation affecting employers and how they behave towards their employees, and they look at working carers' entitlements to time off to care. I want to end my short contribution by talking about research on work care reconciliation, and especially that developed within programmes led by Eurofound, which highlighted some years ago, not very long ago, but began to really think about the elaboration of this form of policy and developed an analysis of a range of work-care reconciliation policy options and configurations. And we still need to understand and investigate more thoroughly their implications. We're talking here about care leaves and how those should be operationalized, who should be available to take care leave, and the distribution of its costs are key issues there. I talk about flexible working options. I talk about job protection and return to work rights, which are an important part of this agenda. And I talk about pension and employment insurance protections so that carers do not lose their work-related benefits. I want to close by commenting on the way I end the chapter, which is about challenges for researchers and policymakers. There is much for researchers still to do in this field on how work-care reconciliation policies operate and on who gains or loses in the short and longer term, on their uptake and the effectiveness of different schemes, which has only been touched upon in detailed research, and on the optimum configurations of policy opportunities and obligations. I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I want to just close by saying that to me, the ubiquity of caring and it's the likelihood that everyone's lives will in future include an episode of caring means that aligning work-care reconciliation policy with wider social policy arrangements is an absolutely fundamental issue for our time and for the future. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Sue, for your contribution. Also, your chapters, as you explained, also offers a very interesting historical reconstruction of how the issue has evolved and changing over time until today. So really, really, really interesting chapter. Okay, I give the floor to Rossella Ciccia. Rossella, sorry for the mistake before. Your chapter has a title as all the others. Okay, it's chapter 6 in the book, and the title is Care in Feminist Welfare State Analysis, the Unfinished Agenda. Okay, so Rossella, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Costanzo. Thank you for reminding the title of my chapter. So sorry. I also want to start by congratulating you and Tine on this excellent handbook and say that it is a real pleasure to be part of this important collective project. So in my chapter, which is it looks at feminist perspective on care, and particularly in comparative feminist welfare state analysis, what I argue is that despite the centrality of care in this scholarship, care has remained in many ways an unfinished agenda. Now, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, care is quite central to feminist understanding of welfare state, and that is because it's deeply tied to gender inequality. And as a result, how to alter this care-gender nexus is a core issue confronting much feminist theorizing on welfare state. Despite this common concern in the scholarship, different strands of it show marked differences, and I think this was touched upon in the presentation by Mary. And this difference concern even basic aspects, such as the definition of care and the definition of gender equality. The first strand of literature that I discuss in the chapter is feminist analysis of welfare regimes. And here care was primarily understood as unpaid work performed by women in the home and analyzed through the lens of citizenship. Now, this research tradition made clear that the exclusion of unpaid domestic work from the realm of social rights reinforced women's dependence on men. And this was an important point, whose significance extended well beyond the feminist perspective. It really transformed the way that we think about the welfare state by introducing the family and care as constitutive elements of welfare state analysis. However, despite all its contribution, this scholarship has also some limitations in its dealing with care. First of all, by focusing on care as a source of social rights, it did not give an equal attention to the way states directly intervene in the organization of care through, for instance, the regulation, financing, and provision of a wide array of care services. Second, the focus on and the primacy of the perspective on women as family caregiver and unpaid domestic work ended up excluding or pushing at the margin the analysis of paid care workers. And this effectively eclipsed the way that racial and class division are embedded in the organization of work. And finally, I think the emphasis on economic independence and autonomy in the scholarship ended up attaching a negative connotation to dependence, and thus created a separation between the rights of the unpaid caregivers and those of the cared for. The second strand of literature I analyze in the chapter is scholarship on care regime and the social organization of care. Now, this body of research marked an important shift because it moved away the attention from domestic work alone to the changing boundaries between public and private responsibility for providing and resourcing care. And in so doing, it significantly expanded the concept of care because care was no longer confined to the domestic or the household, but it included public services, market provision, and the complex interaction between formal and informal care. Now, research on care regime also introduced important concepts such as familialism and defamiliarization, which capture the extent to which care responsibility are located within the family or distributed to state, market, and community actors. So this scholarship too made many contributions, but it also did share some of the limitation of the earlier scholarship on welfare regime. In particular, the family and caregiver remained the main point of reference in the analysis, and the perspective of care receivers and paid care workers continue to be relatively marginal to feminist research on care regimes. So to conclude, I think my take in this chapter is that the conceptualization of care across different strands of feminist welfare state analysis remains incomplete, and particularly when we consider the multiple dimensions of care as both caregiving and care receiving, and the considerable diversity within this category. So in the final part of the chapter, I build on the work of others, particularly a chapter by Chiara Saraceno and Arnold Leyran that they published in the early 2000s, and try to propose that we need to shift more towards a more relational approach, which simultaneously consider both caregivers, paid and unpaid, and care receivers, but especially we need to make relationship between this actor a more central object of the analysis. And this because I think such a perspective could bring several advantages. First of all, it would highlight the interdependence between these different types of actors and their rights. Second, because it would help identifying the source of conflicts and as well as the potential synergies within care relationships, thereby enriching our understanding of the politics of care and the dynamics of care policy reform. And third, because it brings intersectional inequality, including class, race, age, disability, and migration, more central into the analysis of care. But I think the biggest argument for a greater focus on the relationship between different types of actors is that this approach also challenged the dominant emphasis on independence and autonomy that has shaped much policy research on care, not only feminist research, but also gerontology and disability studies. I think if we place care relationship at the center of the analysis, then this helps recognize that dependence and interdependence are fundamental features of human life rather than problems to be eliminated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rossella. Very interesting. And I think that your chapter really gives a very critical perspective on care analysis. So thank you for the chapters and also for your attempt to synthesize everything in a few minutes. I think it worked very well. Thank you so much. When we we asked Chiara Saraceno to draft a chapter about one of the most controversial issues in the last years about the care policy, which is the relation between care policy and social investment. And we got an excellent chapter on that. And I personally thank Chiara for that. And then I'm very happy to give you the floor for presenting this.
Thank you, Costanzo. Thank you, Tina, for inviting me to be part of this very important book. Yes, that is the topic was chosen for me in this chapter. And so what I do in the chapter is to discuss the role that the social investment discourse, rather than policy discourse, has shaped the arguments around care policies at the international, particular level, but also in many cases at the national level. And I discussed the pro and cons because certainly the social investment discourse has been a very powerful tool in many countries to argue in favor of childcare services, for instance. Because within the social investment discourse, it seems that there is like a win-win situation. So you have you support gender equality, supporting women's employment and women's employment. But at the same time, you are careful in not disincentivating fertility, because you support women to both have family obligation, have children if they want to, but also to be part of the labor market. And particularly, which is, I think, is the most important interest of the social policy perspective, you invest in the future human capital. So supporting childcare is a way of having these three things, not wasting, that would be the discourse, women capital, by not restricting it only within the family, but you also invest in the future of human capital. And there is a value, of course, in this discourse, but my criticism, which I develop in my chapter, is that there is first an under-evaluation of care as such. So as such, as a valuable relationship, as a relational activity, as a valuable activity, and also which cannot be only reduced to education. And this also brings us to think more critically at how we always define childcare services, in this case, as early education and care service, because it's not necessarily so. As it was said also by Tine in the beginning, there is a tension between quality and quantity. There is we should not take as given that all childcare services are formally or intentionally also educational one, but at the same time to stress the educational part of childcare services in terms of aim or goal, you at the same time risk undervaluing the care dimension and care need within these services. But another way that the social investment approach undervalues care is its little interest for care leaves. So it's all focused on services. Leaves are taken as granted for mothers, because after all, they have to take some time off to care for their children, but are not thought as truly as an important piece of childcare policies, and even less, I would say, that the gender rebalancing of within the leave system is a particular interest of the social investment, because care is not family care is not as important. It's needed, but it's not an important of the child investment discourse in the social investment discourse. Actually, it is more like perceived as a burden, which has to be taken care of, but is not really important and can even be a risk. Actually, leaves are maternity leaves, but are perceived as a risk from a dual perspective in the social investment discourse, as a risk when the mother is not well educated, because then she can even hamper her child development chances and opportunities. A risk for women if they are well educated, because if they invest too much in family care, in child care, their human capital can be not enough be exploited by the society. So there is this ambivalence, let's say, with regard to care, although the social investment can be used and has been used as a tool to argue in favor of child care services. With regard to disability and long-term care, the social investment discourse is much less developed, and the literature is very minimal. In my chapter, I tried to discuss why is it so. I think that the main reason is the strong focus of the social investment discussions on human capital, and therefore long-term care is not interesting from this point of view as in terms of social investment. It can be interesting only from the point of view of freeing family carers somewhat in order to be able to be part of the labor force. But that is the only way it can be framed as a social investment aim. With regard to disability, it is probably more usable in terms of discourse, but it's competing with a much more developed discourse like rehabilitation, independent living, and so on and so forth. And actually, I would say that all the disability movement, not only discourses which have contested the traditional approach to disability and to persons with disability. Like I remember the OECD discourse movement turning disability into ability. So they've developed a discourse on the value and even the importance of supporting the participation of persons with disability in society and also in the labor force much before the social investment discourse. So I think that the social investment discourse, with regard to this particular field of care, has been less strong and less used for because of its weakness, let's say, because of its focus on human capital, but at the same time also because it was competing with richer and more important discourse to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. I think that you were able to really to sum up the most important aspect of your chapter, which I think is really interesting because it shows exactly the pros and cons and the difficult relationship between social investment and social care perspectives. Now it's time to give the floor to Michael Fine. Thanks, Michael, for accepting to discuss the handbook as a whole.
Yes.
I remember the people that you are honorary professor at the Macquarie University, Sydney. Now I think that you talk from Australia, so your time is quite different from the European one. And I think that most of the people here already know your book titled A Caring Society, question mark, which was, again, I think edited again in 2018 by Palgrave. So, okay. So I give you the floor. Thanks.
Costanzo, thank you very much for the generous invitation. And I've been thinking, what was I thinking when I accepted it? I haven't had an opportunity to read most of the chapters that we've heard discussed tonight, sadly, and it is, of course, not only a great honour, but a great opportunity to be engaged in such a discussion. So, look, I'm going to keep my comments short because there is so much that we do need to talk about, but just I'd like to pick up on a few issues that emerge, I think, from the, I think, 5-6 papers that we've just heard today. Just starting off, the question of research struck me right at the beginning. Is this a research handbook when I started to look at it? And normally when we look at a research handbook, it's full up with facts and figures and findings. And of course, what is so precious about this research handbook is that is exactly what it doesn't do. The figures that you presented in your paper were terrific from 2017, but they weren't even up to date, dare I say it. That's not a criticism. The value I see in the work that you're putting forward is not just data, but what we're dealing here with is theory. And without theory, we don't really have much opportunity to do research. What we can do is we can describe the world around us, and people have always done that. We can interpret it, we can seek to understand it, but we need tools, and the tools that we need to conduct research are theories. And as Kurt Lewin reminds us, you've heard that famous aphorism, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And I want to finish later on with coming back to that concept. There's so much that we could talk about. I'd like to pick up the idea that we're in a new period of politicization, or that care is somehow or other becoming more politicized than it's been in the past. And I just wonder if that is actually analytically possible. Surely care is not new. Care was neglected. We didn't analyze it. It was taken for granted. We lacked even attention to the field, let alone we lack a vocabulary. And this is what this piece of work has really helped to do, to draw that vocabulary out into the open. We lacked hypotheses. We lacked issues of where do we put our emphasis when we're discussing care. So often care just became reduced, when we did talk about it, to a moral value. She's a caring person, he's a caring person. To care was, in English, for a start, it meant to worry about something. To worry about something is not that far removed from having responsibility for, and care is about that. But it has always been politicised. What I think has happened is that we're now starting to we've identified the politicisation of care much more clearly in this particular set of literature that you're talking about in your book, in your collection, and that we're talking about in today's seminar. And we might contrast it with the ones, I think it was Mary who talked about the ways in which we can see care in other fields. And I think her third field of research organisation literature where we're looking at, for example, research from health researchers or research from psychologists or, for that matter, from management consultants, and certainly in Australia, but I think internationally, a lot of the most crucial policy determining work is done by various consulting firms. All of this is deeply political, of course, but there's not an attempt to try and identify the politics involved. There's not an attempt to identify the stance of the researcher, nor to uncover the political origins of the decisions that are being made about either the unrecognised, unpaid care that women have for so long pursued. I might say that in a certain sense, the invisibility of care also applies to many male carers, and that is also something we need to identify with appropriately and help encourage more men, of course, to care. But for too long, we've failed to do that. Now, once we identify the politicisation of care as a central component of our research framework, the question I think that I'd like to pose for discussion is, what is the value of that? How can we turn that into something that's not just critical, that's not just a politics of grievance, not just an analysis that complains about the sort of lack of depth in our understanding of the situation of, for example, the establishment of or the shift of policy towards marketised services, away from publicly provided services, or away from churches or civil societies concerned for care. But we also start to have to think a lot more about what possible use we can put this analysis. And I think that actually we do know that many of us see in this work that we're doing, we see a potential for a tool that might help us understand the situation, the problems that we're facing in the actual provision of care services, the provision of care at home as a form of, I think, care of work. That I think that's quite helpful for us to discuss that. And I hope that's something that will come out in the next moment of our seminar. I also wanted to raise the question of the value of care regimes. And Tina, as she spoke, and in your chapter, which you shared with her, Costanzo, you talk about how care regimes, nothing much has changed. And yet it's just glaring to me just how much change there is. First of all, we used Esping Anderson identified 3 welfare regimes, and quickly this became care regimes, and Antonin's work and others have been very valuable. But we look at, say, for example, the Asian nations that you identified with, and that's just some of them. Of course, care, the arrangements for care in those countries have been changing massively over the last 20 or 30 years. The arrangements of care in China, which isn't even mentioned in any of these schemes. How massive have those been? They're very important. And there's those whole range of changes that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And I think that we actually do talk about much change even within particular regimes. And I'm quite aware of a strong literature on the negative impacts of marketisation in Nordic care systems, for example. To talk about Nordic care as being unchanging strikes me as in a different world to the way that I'm thinking about it. So I think it might be helpful for us to just turn back and reflect on the value of care regimes. Mary, I thank you so much for your work, and I think that was you expressed it so concisely, but I think so many of us have tried to grapple with those issues that you so eloquently spoke to. And I loved the way you spoke about that care. You didn't really go into the sort of work where we look at care as a moral theory, the work of people like Joan Tronto and so many of the moral philosophers from North America region. But I think I would have added that or thought about how that engages with those 4 fields of care that you spoke about. But I think you're so right in being positive in thinking about how can care actually aid us and guide us in our further work. I think in a sense, we've often looked at it as a sort of a settled question from the beginning. We know that care was a burden. That was the first sort of generation of feminist work, not the first generation of feminism, but of feminist work on care in the 1970s, that care became a burden for women. We had to reduce it. Then the answer came, no, care was women's value, and we need to see that as central to the way in which modern democracies operate. That was Joan Tronto and others contributed that. But I like that rather optimistic way in which you're looking forward to how we might refine our attention, and through studying it as an interrelational concept, how much richer it's going to be than simply this sort of one-way interaction that we've had. I would ask the question, where is self-care in this discussion? We haven't talked about self-care, either care as self-care for herself or himself, but also the care of that we have as responsibility for as citizens to care for ourselves, we might say, and that's what we're taught to do. I'd like to go on with that and hope that we can draw that out in further discussion. And finally, I just thought that was also so a really interesting, Rosella and Chiara. I haven't got time to go into all of those, but just let me pick up the question that Chiara raised about the social investment component that we see in childcare, but not in disability or aged care. Well, it has been really central to our discussion in Australia in the development in recent years of what's called the NDIS, a major program for people with disabilities. They had very basic elementary support services, or those who really were totally dependent were traditionally locked up in institutions. But in introducing the NDIS about 10 years ago, they expanded expenditure, and that has gone up something like 500% over the last decade, to the point now it really does have to be reined in by any means. But it was justified by the fact that, well, this is a temporary expenditure. We're going to have all these people who are just getting services at them, who need care, who need something but haven't got anything. By giving them support, they're going to be able to work. They're going to be able to pay taxes. They'll become contributory. They will contribute to the economy, and that will benefit. So there was a social investment argument there. And I think there is a hidden social investment argument in aged care. And frankly, that's a rather ugly argument that we like to avoid. So aged care really, when in my study of it, started when they tried to, we've had it for centuries, but it's really to try and remove older people from the mainstream and sequester them out of the way, and somehow or other save money and allow other people to continue to work. So we think of the emergence of modern aged care in the post-Second World War period. First step was really removing older people from long-term care hospitals. We did that as we invented penicillins and the capacity for short-term specialist treatment in hospitals. We developed then a parallel system of institutions, nursing homes, or whatever we might call them. Then we thought, oh, we can even get better. We can do this community care that was even cheaper. So I think that we see that logic there, but it's a rather darker one. I won't continue. I think that there's so much more that other people can say, but I do want to just say what a stimulating and exciting volume it is, and just how much potential it has to really go into the depth that each of these chapters has gone to discuss particular concepts so richly and so wonderfully. I think this is quite a landmark book, and I congratulate all the authors, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Michael. There are also a lot of data and empirical facts in other chapters in the handbook.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
Okay. I pass the floor to Tine for chairing the open discussion. Tine, you need to switch the mic on.
Oh, yes, you're on mute.
Sorry, rookie mistake. Thank you very much, Michael. It was wonderful to have your reflections. We could have had them before and had engaged in a good discussion, I think, before we submitted the book. But we got the opportunity now. So wonderful. So now the floor is open for comments and questions to the panelists, and including Michael, if you want to address some of what he said. We encourage you to use the function of raising your hand, and then we can see who are indicating that they would like to speak. You are also welcome to write in the chat function, so we can follow there. And the panelists are also welcome to ask comments.
Sue Yandel has her hand up, so.
She does indeed. So Sue, you have the floor.
I just wanted to briefly mention that in my analysis and in the and I hope how I've explained it in the chapter in the book, work-care reconciliation is as much about the right to care as it is about the right to work. So I don't see, just responding to Michael's comment, I don't see it as about freeing people from caring responsibilities so that they can work. I see it as about enabling people to have a balance in their lives, which is inherently valuable, that caring is not to be seen exclusively as burdensome. Of course, aspects of care are demanding and stressful and difficult, and particularly if you're caring for someone who is very ill or whose condition is deteriorating or who's dying, it can be very emotionally challenging. But it's also a privilege to care for another person, and lots of people writing about their experience of care talk about that. And so I think it's important that we don't see some of the trends as about shifting the burden of care. I think it's about enabling our society to become more caring, so our different societies, to enabling them to interweave caring with other aspects of life, which are also important for people's well-being. So that was just a comment on that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Point well taken. Yeah.
Yep. Maybe I can raise the issue about self-care, Michael, because that was actually raised at one of the Transforming Care conferences some years ago. And it triggered a lot of questions, but I think also some challenges, because how to conceptualize this within our, you can say, normal approach of how we approach care. So in my mind, I find it an interesting alley, but I'm wondering also if it's maybe not a detour in a way in terms of our analytical strictness and explicitity. So I'd love to hear a bit more on your thoughts on that.
It strikes me, I suppose, look, I've just had a dreadful experience. My brother died about a week and a half ago, and he died after much of his life as a heroin addict. He was maintained on methadone. And talk about dependency, he was dependent on his methadone when he could get it, and when he was able to buy heroin, which he did when my parents died and he got a small inheritance again, he started using that again while that was happening, you know. And as I said my farewell to him, and we just had his funeral last week, I just felt, look, I really failed in caring for you. I battled away with it. I really battled, as did his sisters and as did his other brother, and my parents were wonderful. They looked up, they had him at home, and they pretended that there was no heroin involved. But this idea of sort of somehow, but it made explicit to me just how important it is that people are learning the capacity to care for themselves. That's part of what nurturing a child is about, learning to teach that child to be responsible. This is sort of in some of the work, I'm not a Foucauldian, but in the work of the care of the self that Foucault writes about, it captures some of that concept. And I just think that where does care of the self fit in our research frameworks? We so little talk about it. I love the idea that we think of care as a relationship. That is a big step, and it's so obvious once you think about it, and yet for many years we weren't making it explicit. It's very helpful to talk about care in those frameworks. But I think to try and draw self-care back into the picture again would also be very helpful. Where does that fit? Too often, a simple thing is, we all know this consumer-directed care. The consumers supposedly choose what they want to do. What about when they choose something which is very unhealthy? For example, a friend of mine who I was supporting decided he needed to stay in bed permanently. And the service who was looking after him decided, yes, well, that's what he wants. We'll allow him to do that. And he deteriorated and, of course, became completely socially isolated, never saw anyone but the care staff who came to him, never left his home, despite the fact he was quite capable of doing all of those things. I just wonder about this self-care as yet another one of those sort of boundary issues that needs to be brought into our framework too, and in the way that Mary suggested.
Yeah, and I think it does come in, for instance, in our discussions on informal carers, parents, also in terms of burnout and so on. So the consideration of your own needs, kind of before you can help each other. I still do think we need some different analytical tools in order to capture this. Chiara has her hand up.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Michael. I agree with you. And actually, in my chapter, I say that with regard to long-term care, particularly, but in part also disability care, the budget is the main focus of the social investment. Budget efficiency, cost containment are the most important part of the so-called social investment discourse. Not so much the individuals who should be invested in. That is my idea. With regard to disability, what I just say that I do not find anything in the social investment discourse which is new compared to older discourse by the disability movement. Maybe that is they changed the wording, but to be à la page. But I think that many things which have been said and promoted within the disability had already been developed, and that was my argument. While with regard to childcare, there was this social investing in children in the future, and so that which was really new, let's say, although some part of it was already in the early education movement. But while the early education movement was maybe a little bit more attentive to the welfare of children now, let's say, the social investment is more interested in the future, in children as the future human capital, which is a limitation to me. Let's say. Both of them share an idea of equal opportunities among children, which is important. It's a strong argument in terms of equal opportunities in development, but it's more towards the future of human capital in terms of the social investment discourse than in the early education discourse.
I just think from an investment perspective, for example, many firms often have investments in things that they don't expand the investment in. They leave them idle. For example, they buy blocks of land and they just wait for years while the value goes up. And I started to think about aged care in that sort of sense. It was a sort of like a negative investment. You just try to reduce expenditure to a minimum and you or to what's necessary, but it has a different discourse. It's not an idealistic investment, but it is a form as an analytic tool. I like that sense of the idea of social investment. It is quite a powerful analysis, and I suppose that fits in with thinking of us having a care economy more broadly. It was a theme I didn't go into, but was also central to this book and collection and the discussions that we really need to think through.
Thank you, Michael. And can I add, I think reablement, which is a strategy which is applied in across some countries, and we even have a book about it in the Transforming Care series. So this is, for me, a social investment strategy in terms of long-term care, trying actively to reduce dependence in daily tasks among elderly, and certainly with the intention also to cut costs. But it turns out that it does increase quality of life as well. So that's of course a good thing. But it's also something that changes our whole perception of what is care, because it's a bit of self-care, taking care of yourself, and rather than us coming and helping you. So it certainly is a challenge in terms of the understanding of what is care. Mary, did you have a comment in particular to this point before we go to Rosella, or?
No, I didn't, but sorry. But Rosella is before me. I'd like to make a comment, but Rosella has had her hand up before me.
Yes, so let's go to Rosella.
Thank you, Maria and Tine. So I had a comment response to the first question that Michael posed about, what's the use of the politics of care? Is it more than a politics of grievances? And link it to self-care. And because I think, the more I work on this topic, the more I try to look at it from different angles. And I think what we need to ask ourselves, what I try to ask myself in the chapter, is the politics of care a politics of reducing dependency? So kind of like what Kara says when he talks about social investment, or should it be a politics for sustaining relationships of care? And I think it should be the second. And if it's the second, then we can use it to analyze everything, particularly around the state, which is also not about care. And I think that for me is the lens. And it's also the lens through which to look at self-care, which is something that I was fond of and less so now from a feminist perspective, because everything in care has the ability to be bent, stretched, and appropriated. And so it's become very personalized and apolitical. But I think if we link self-care to a form, because, my ability to self-care is not equal to someone else, right? And it's shaped politically. And then if I see this as my ability to self-care is shaped by relationship of care, it becomes part, I think, of the analysis of the politics of care. So I just wanted to make this point, which it was a kind of not contradicting what was said today, but like a response to what you asked at the beginning. And maybe if I have the time, it's true, care regimes have changed a lot. And I think we don't recognize that, just like with welfare regime, we try to emphasize stability instead of change. But the analytical tools that we have is still very useful. We see the Nordics, going to the distributional responsibility shifting to our markets. We see Latin America shifting to a community and the state. And so if we recognize that the configuration are changing, but the tool is still very, the analytical tool that was developed is still quite interesting and can be also innovated based on what's happening in the world. That's all.
Thank you, Rosella. Mary?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And Michael, particularly, I just want to address maybe two things together. The point about the ethics of care perspective, and also then the point about regimes. And I think, I do very briefly refer to the ethics of care perspective in my chapter, but there is a problem, I think, with that perspective in some ways, because it doesn't really talk a lot about the state, and it doesn't talk about the organization of care in society very much, I think. And that was the kind of angle that I was coming at. But there is a broader point, I think, to be made here, and it brings in the notion of the utility of regimes. And that is, the more abstract we become, or the kind of larger in the sense, or more macro we become, the more we lose the insights of individual perspectives and also individual policies. So we cleave to this regime analysis because it has the virtues of allowing us to talk about big things and to look across countries. And we all know, I think, or most of us know, that those comparisons really are not robust if we're really concerned about what it's like in real life, in everyday life, for real people and real policies. And in some ways, it's the same when you look at the literature. When you're trying to bring literature together that crosses a broad field, you're making all these pulling and pushing stuff. So actually, the thing about the ethics of care literature is it doesn't really fit that well. But then none of the other literatures are reducible to one set of insights as well. And I think Rosello was kind of saying that in her chapter as well. And so that's a kind of a slightly different perspective on, you know, what the limits of what I was trying to do in a way in the chapter.
Thank you. I think that might need to be the final point. It's now past. Costanzo, do you agree we should bid farewell? Thanking the panelists for their very good contributions today. Thank you very much, Michael Fine, to stepping in and just giving us from the outside your view on the book. Thank you very much to everybody who participated today, and hope to see you at the next Transforming Care conference. And otherwise, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.